Hi everyone in Algebra 3. This is going to be your questions on lesson 63. This is going to be a longer video because there's a lot of questions that we're going to go through, so please sit tight. So the first one is going to be how many distinguishable ways can 4 identical red flags and 3 identical green flags be arranged in a row? Well, we're going to start with the equation n factorial over a factorial b factorial. So n is going to be the total number of objects within, which in this case is going to be 7 flags. Then we're going to divide that by 4 factorial, 3 factorial. When we multiply that out, it'll be 7, 6, 5, and then 4 factorial over 4 factorial times 3 times 2 times 1. The 4 factorials would cancel, and 3 times 2 is 6. So our answer is going to be 35 different ways that we can arrange those flags. Next, we're going to look at number 4. That says, how many ways can 3 boys and 2 girls sit in a row if boys cannot sit next to one another? So for number 4, five boxes, and we have to identify where all the boys are going to sit, which would be all of these seats because they can't sit next to each other. So we're starting with 3 boys, then 2 boys and 1 boy. Then for girls, we have 2 times 1. So these are all the boys' seats. And then the girls. And then 3 times 2 is 6, times 2 is 12. So there would be 12 different ways those people can sit in a row if the boys cannot sit next to each other. Next, we're going to look at number 6. So for number 6, we have Marta traveled m miles at a miles per hour, and Christelle traveled the same distance but at a slower rate of b miles per hour. What is the difference in hours between the times of the 2 girls? Well, I'm going to start with the distance of Marta is going to be m, and the rate of Marta is going to be a, which means that the time of Marta is going to be m over a, distance divided by rate. Christelle, the distance of Christelle is going to be the same, which is m, but at a slower rate of b miles per hour. So the rate of Christelle is b, which means the time of Christelle is going to be m over b. So what we're trying to determine is whose time is longer so that we can find the difference between them. And if Christelle traveled slower, that means her time is going to be longer. So in order to find the difference between the two, we're going to take Christelle's time, m over b, and subtract Marta's time, which is m over a. You subtract the smaller time from the bigger time. You're going to make a common denominator, which would be a m minus bm all over ab. And that would be your result. So again, you just needed to figure out which time was longer so that you could subtract the shorter one from the longer one. Moving on to number 7, it says Henry traveled a miles in b hours and then increases rate by c miles per hour. How long would it take him to travel 1,000 miles at the new rate? So we have Henry traveled, so for number 7, distance, we have a, time would be b, and his rate, original rate would be a over b, so distance divided by time. His new rate, it says, increased his rate by c miles per hour. So it's his original rate increased by c. So you're going to make a common denominator, which would be a plus bc all over b. That's his new rate. His distance is going to be 1,000. So we're solving for time. So if distance equals rate times time, I have distance equals rate times time. So to get time by itself, you're going to multiply both sides by the reciprocal. So that means your new time is going to be equal to 1000 B over A plus B C. And that would be your result. So you have to solve for the original rate and then increase the rate. And then you just solve using distance equals rate times time. Moving on to number 12, we know if the mean of 5 numbers is 20, the sum of the numbers must be 5 times 20 or 100. If the data points are 24, 16, 18, x, and 28, and the mean is 20, what is the value of the missing data point? So for number 12, it says that the sum of the numbers has to be 5 times 20 or 100. So that means 16 plus 18 plus 24 plus x plus 28 has to add up to 100, which means that 100 minus 28 minus 24 minus 16 minus 18, that means our x is going to be equal to 14. So my numbers that I have, the data points are going to be 14, 16, 18, 24, and 28. It says, so it's find the missing data point, which is 14. Find the range. So that's just biggest minus the smallest, so 28 minus 14, which is just going to be 14. Find the median, which is the middle number. So middle would be 18. And then standard deviation. So we're going to use our calculator. So in our calculator, I'm going to do second 7 to make sure there's nothing in the calculator. It says error. That means there's nothing there. I'm going to input my values using this E plus button. So 14, 16, 18, 24, and 28. So in total, I should have 5 values. And to find the standard deviation, you use second divide. And our standard deviation would be 5.22. And those would be your other answers in addition to the x is equal to 14. Now moving on, we're going to look at number 15. So the first thing that I'm going to do for number 15 is I'm going to move the 1/4 to the other side. So I have 15, I have cosine squared, theta equals 1/4. To get rid of the squared, I'm going to square root both sides. Don't forget that when you take the square root, you get plus or minus that value. The square root of 1 is 1, square root of 4 is 2. So now that we have cosine theta, we're going to separate that into 2 equations. I'm going to have cosine theta is equal to positive 1/2. And then I'm going to have cosine theta equals negative 1/2. Now using our chart, we have A, S, T, C. So everything is positive in quadrant 1 and cosine is positive in quadrant 4. So for this first one, I'm going to draw my triangles in quadrants 1 and 4. My adjacent is 1, my hypotenuse is 2, so 1, 2. Now this angle is going to be 60 degrees. So in quadrant 1, we're going to leave it as 60, but in quadrant 4, I have to subtract that 60 from 360, so that would be 300 degrees. Those would be my 2 answers. Then I'm going to draw where cosine is negative. Well, if it's positive in 1 and 4, that means it's going to be negative in 2 and 3. My adjacent's negative 1, my hypotenuse is 2. It is the same angle, it's still going to be a 60-degree angle. So in quadrant 2, I have to subtract it from 180, which would be 120. And then in quadrant 3, I'm going to add it to 180, which would be 240. And that would complete all of your answers for number 15. So there should be 4 total answers. Now moving on to number 16. So for number 16, you'll notice that within those 2 pieces of the puzzle, there's cosine thetas in both terms. So I'm going to factor out a cosine theta. So in the first time, I'd be left with sine theta. Second term, I'd be left with -1. And now what we're going to do is we're going to set each piece equal to 0. So cosine theta equals 0, and then sine theta -1 equals 0. So when you solve for sine theta, you move the 1 to the other side, and it would be equal to +1. Now, both of these are not going to use a reference triangle, so I have to actually draw my unit circle. For cosine, it's equal to the x-coordinate, and for sine, it's equal to the y-coordinate. So for cosine, I'm looking for where the x-coordinate is equal to 0. So if I look at all my x-coordinates here, there are 2 places where the x-coordinate is equal to 0, and that is at 90 degrees and at 270 degrees. So theta would be equal to 90 degrees and 270. Then for sine, sine is equal to the y-coordinate. So at what degree is the y-coordinate equal to 1? Well, if I look at all my y-coordinates, there's only one place where the y-coordinate is equal to 1, and that was at 90 degrees. And I have already listed 90 degrees as one of my answers for the first part of the equation. So I don't have to list it again, but your answer would be 90 and 270. Now moving on, we're looking at number 18. So for number 18, I see a minus sign in between my 2 logarithms, so I need to actually divide those 2 terms. So that would give me log base 1/2 of x plus 3 over x minus 2 is equal to log 1/2 of 2. Now to get rid of the log 1/2, I'm going to raise both sides to the power of 1/2. So it'd be 1/2 to the power of log 1/2, and that cancels. Now I have x plus 3 over x minus 2 is equal to 2 over 1. You're going to cross multiply that. So I had x plus 3 is equal to 2x minus 4. If you multiply 2 times x and then 2 times -2. I'm going to bring the x to this side, so subtract x. I'm going to add 4 to the other side, and I would get x is equal to 7. And that would conclude number 18. Now moving on to number 19, which is the distance between a point and the line. So this is going to be one of those problems that has multiple steps. And what we have to do first is we actually have to solve that for that line. So for number 19, I have to put this into slope-intercept form. So that would be y equals x minus 6. Now, step number 1 is to find the equation line that's perpendicular to that line, but goes through the point -2, 4. So I have to flip the slope and then solve for my plus b. So that would be -x plus b. Solve for plus b by plugging in my points, which would be 4 equals -2 plus b. So b would be equal to 2. So now my equation of my perpendicular line is going to be y is equal to -x plus 2. Now step 2 is going to be to set this line, the original line, equal to this line because I want to find out where these two lines are intersecting. So I'm going to set x minus 6 equal to my perpendicular line, which is negative x plus 2. So if you bring the x over, I get 2x. If I bring the 6 over to the right, that would give me 8, which means that my x coordinate is going to be equal to 4. Now for step 3, I have to solve for the y coordinate. So I just plug this x minus equals 4 into either this line, the perpendicular line, or the original line. So if I plug it into the original line, it would be 4 minus 6. So y would be equal to negative 2. Now your final step 4 is to find the distance between those 2 points. And that would be the square root of x1, which is negative 2, minus x2 squared, plus y1, which is 4, minus y2, which is negative 2 squared. So that would give us negative 6 squared plus 4 plus 2 is also 6, so 6 squared. So I have 36 plus 36. Now the square root of 72 can be simplified to 6 square root 2. And that would be your distance. Okay, so number 19 is a 4-step problem, making sure that you solve for all of the points or all of the steps, which is perpendicular line that goes through this point. Find where those two lines intersect by setting those lines equal to each other, and then plugging that into the distance formula. Okay, so for number 20, the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to put everything that contains a x into parentheses. So that would be 2x squared minus 12x and then plus 9. Before I can complete the square, I have to factor out that 2. So that would become 2x squared minus 6x plus 9. Now I complete the square with my parentheses. So half of negative 6 is negative 3. And when I square that, it's going to become plus 9. But remember that this is actually a plus 18. So when I do the opposite on the outside, opposite of positive 18 would be minus 18. Which means that this 2 is what I'm going to multiply by my y coordinate line on my xy chart. But it's positive, so it's going to be a happy face parabola. My x minus 3, I'm going to set equal to 0 to solve for the axis of symmetry, which would be at x is equal to 3. And this is going to be my vertex, or where I'm going to start my parabola. So I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 1, 2. My axis of symmetry is going to be at positive 3. And then at negative 9 is going to be my vertex. Now, how am I going to find my other points? Well, I have this chart, which tells me 1, 1, 2, 4, 3, 9. But I actually have to go through and multiply this bottom line by 2 because of this 2 that's on the outside. So if I multiply the y coordinates by 2, 1 times 2 is 2, 4 times 2 is 8, 9 times 2 is 18. So from my vertex, I'm going to go over 1 up 2 in both directions, and then over 2 up 8. So that would be all the way up to here. And then you're going to connect your points to make a happy face parabola where the axis of symmetry is at 3. The vertex is at negative 9. Now moving on, we're going to look at number 22. So for number 22, we need to look at this diagram right here. So for number 22, it says that we need to write the equation of the following sinusoid in terms of a sine function. Well, if you look at that, it already is in terms of a sine function. It's actually a positive sine function. So for number 22, I have y is equal to a plus b sine c, and then it would be x minus d. Well, it's already a sine function, so I'm not going to need the phase shift of d. So now I just need to solve for a and b. So the first thing for a is going to be the midpoint between 2 and -8. So 2 plus -8 divided by 2. So -6 divided by 2 would be -3. B is the amplitude, so it's going to be the distance between the top and this line that I just got, which is -3. So it'd be 2 minus -3, which gives us 5. Then C is our coefficient. In this case, it's in radians, so it's 2 pi divided by the length of the period. Now I'm going to calculate the length of the period as this. It starts at 0 degrees, it circles up, circles down, and then touches the x-axis again at 4 pi. So it needs to rotate fully, and that would be, the distance would be 4 pi. So 2 pi divided by the length of the period would be 4 pi. The pi's would cancel, and I would be left with 1/2. Now I'm just going to rewrite my equation as y is equal to a, which is -3, plus b, which is 5, sine c, which is 1/2, and then we don't have a phase shift because it's already in a sine function, so it would be just x. And that would be your result. Okay, and then moving on, we have to find the area of the triangle for number 23. So for number 23, we're trying to find the area of the triangle in square centimeters. And so 23, the triangle is going to be an obtuse triangle, so it looks kind of like this. The angle is 140. The base is 0.6 meters, and the slant is 0.8 meters. Now I'm going to create a right triangle on the outside so that I can calculate the height. This is my right angle. This right here, if I find the supplement of that angle, it would be 40 degrees. I also need to convert from meters to centimeters. So this 0.8 meters converted into centimeters, because there's 100 centimeters in 1 meter, would be equal to 80 centimeters. So now I'm going to use sine because sine is opposite over hypotenuse. So if this is 40 degrees, the opposite would be the height. The hypotenuse would be the 80 centimeters. So that means I have sine of 40 equals opposite, which is the height, over hypotenuse, which is now 80. So in my calculator, I'm going to do 80 times 40 sine equals, and that will give me a height of approximately 51.42. I'm going to leave it in my calculator though, because I'm going to find the area now. The area is base times height divided by 2, so 1/2 base. Now if I convert this from meters to centimeters, it would be 60. So my base would be 60 times the height, which is the 51.42. But I know that 2 goes into 60 30 times. So really I'm just multiplying my given height by 30. And that would give you a result of 1,000 542.69, and that would be centimeters squared. Okay. Now for number 25, we have to find the area of a segment bounded by an arc of 160 degrees and a chord which joins the endpoints of an arc in a circle whose radius is 10 centimeters. So for number 25, we have a formula, and that would be area of the segment is equal to x degrees over 360 times pi r squared minus the triangle, which is r times r sine of x, or base times height divided by 2. Now the x degrees they give us is 160 over 360 times pi times 10 squared minus 10 times 10 sine of 160 divided by 2. So basically, now that I know the formula, I'm just going to use my calculator to evaluate. So I'm going to do 160 times pi times 100 and divide that by 360. And that would give me 139.6263. And then for the second part, I'm going to do 10 times 10 times 160 sine equals, and then divide that by 2. And that would give me 17.101. And I am subtracting that from 139.6263. And that would give me a result of 122.53. And that would be in centimeters squared. And that would be a result for number 25. So now for number 26, we're asked to graph all of these. Well, to graph x squared plus y squared is less than 9, that's actually just going to be a circle centered at 0, 0. So at 0, 0 would be the center of the circle. When you take the square root of the right side, that tells me the radius is 3. So in either direction, it's going to go out 3, and then you're going to connect those spot dots. Now I have y is equal to x, which is going to be a solid line. Crosses at 0, 0, and it's just a slanted line. Y is equal to negative x is another line, but it's just going to slope down from left to right. So I have this graph right there. Now, when it says greater than, that means it's going to be everything above. So y is greater than. I'm going to shade everything above both of those lines. But that does differ for my circle. So it says x squared plus y squared is going to be less than the radius. That means it's going to be everything from the radius in. From the radius in. So less than would be the radius in. So for this one, I would shade everything inside of the circle. Now for this one, I'm going to shade everything above the positive line. So everything above the positive line would be everything here. And then my last one would be to shade everything above my negative line, which would be here. So I know it's kind of hard to see, but your answer is going to be where all three of those line or those squiggly lines kind of overlap, and that would be inside the circle and then above both of those lines. So that would be your section that's satisfied by all three of those equations. Now moving on to number 27. So there's sine squared of 3 pi over 2 plus cosine squared of 3 pi over 2. So for 3 pi over 2, my chart will have an arrow here, an arrow here, then an arrow here, and here. So if I'm counting 3 pi, I count starting in quadrant 1. So this would be 1, 2, 3. Well, at that point, this would be 270 degrees, which would be 0, -1. Now sine is equal to the y coordinate, and then cosine is equal to the x coordinate. So the sine at 270 degrees would be -1. So I'd have -1 squared plus the x coordinate squared, which is 0. Now -1 squared is just 1, so 1 plus 0 would be 1. So again, that's going to use the unit circle because it's over 2, meaning that the only arrows would be at 90 and then 180 and then 270 and 360. Now for the next one, I'm looking at the cosine squared of -405 minus sine squared of -405. So -405 degrees, it's greater than 360, so I'm going to add 360 to that. And that would give me, so -405 plus 360 would actually give me 45, -45. And -45 degrees is going to be a right triangle in quadrant 4. If the angle is 45 degrees, the adjacent will be 1, the opposite will be -1, and the hypotenuse will be √2. Now, if you're doing cosine of this triangle, it would be adjacent over hypotenuse, which would be 1 over √2, but you are squaring that. And then you're subtracting the sine of that triangle, which would be opposite over hypotenuse, which would be -1 over √2, and then you're squaring that as well. So 1 over √2 squared is actually 1/2. And then -1 over √2 squared is also 1/2. So 1/2 minus 1/2 is actually going to give us 0. Now moving on, we're going to look at number 30. This is the last problem. So for this one, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to start with looking at this portion. So for number 30, I'm going to do G composite f of 13, which means that I'm going to plug 13 into the f function. Well, the f function is right here, and that would be, G of 8 to the 13. So I plugged in 13 to where I saw an x. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this and I'm going to plug it into the g function. So when I plug it into the g function, I would get 2 times log 8 of 8 to the power of 13, because I replaced this x with 8 to the 13. When there's a number outside my log, though, it becomes the exponent. So I would have log 8 to the 13 to the power of 2. So that 2 goes to the power of the 8 to the 13. We do multiply those values, so you get log 8 of 8 to the 26th power. Now what you should know is that if your log space and the base of your number next to it are the same, they actually cancel. So you are left with the result of 26. And that concludes your questions from lesson 63. I hope you guys all have a great day. Bye.